Alger Hiss took the stand on June 23, 1949, and stayed there for all or part of 4 days. He did very well on the whole. Stryker first asked him if he'd committed perjury before the grand jury, and Hiss answered no. Then Stryker walked Hiss through the resume to die for, and the emphasis was on all the times and places at the Supreme Court, in private law practice, at the international conferences, where Hiss had been trusted with secrets by people who were very good at picking trustworthy people, and he'd never breached a confidence he'd been given or never been shown to have done so. And the implication was, though, that you might find it self-serving coming from his own mouth, unless the prosecution proved otherwise. This is indeed a trustworthy man. Stryker asked Hiss about every single bad deed that Chambers had attributed to him, passing the handwritten State Department documents, asking Mrs. Hiss to type up the documents to be passed on to Chambers, the two families' social life, especially driving hither and yon on trips and visiting each other's homes, and the trip to Peterborough, New Hampshire, and $400 car loan, and on and on. And Hiss denied emphatically that any of those events or anything like what Chambers said ever happened. He described his actual dealings with the alleged freelance journalist and deadbeat subtenant George Crosley from their first meeting, which he now put around the turn of the year from 34 to 35, to the two men agreeing to the subtenancy at lunch in April 35, to Crosley having trouble moving his things down to Washington and living along with his wife and baby daughter under the same roof with the Hisses in their new home for a few days in late April 35, to Crosley moving out and then into the Hisses' empty apartment for May and June, moving out at the end without paying Hiss any rent except for a pittance. A few more encounters, some by phone, some face-to-face at the Nye Committee, in which Crosley always promised to pay the rent but didn't. Hiss giving Crosley his Ford, his 1929 Ford, which Hiss now said he did in late May or early June 36, which is for the first time as close to what the records of the DMV show. Crosley showing up unexpectedly one evening in the late spring of 36 and giving Hiss the rug. And the last time we met, Hiss said, was when Crosley asked him for a small loan, not the first time, in late May or early June in 36, and Hiss told him to go away. Now, Hiss also came up with explanation number 2 of how the spy documents came to be typed on Hiss's home typewriter. You may recall that the grand jury did not believe Hiss's first story, that Chambers broke into his house and typed them up himself when no one was looking and then tiptoed off and waited for years to spring them on Hiss. What Hiss now did was he said, Woodstock 230099, that's my home typewriter, I'd know it anywhere. And he said, we gave the Woodstock away before the spy documents were typed on it. Specifically, he said, in connection with one of our moves, either the June 36 move to 30th Street or the December 29, 37 move to Volta Place. We got help in moving from two sons of our housemaid, Claudia Catlett. The two sons were Raymond and Perry, both in their mid-teens at the time. They lived with their mother, a sister, a couple of other people at 2728 P Street in Georgetown. And the Catlett kids were sort of neighborhood odd jobbers. They'd wash your car and your windows, mow your lawn, that kind of thing. And Raymond and Perry helped us move, and as part payment for their services, we gave them stuff we didn't want to lug to the new house, and one of those things was the big old Woodstock, the Hiss home typewriter. He said we left it behind for them. I don't recall exactly when or where, but the main point is that the move, when we parted with the Hiss home typewriter, occurred in 36 or late 37, and therefore, when the spy documents were typed on it in early 38, it was no longer ours. It was out of our possession and control, and presumably the Catlett kids owned it. Finally, Stryker asked, Mr. Hiss, you have entered your formal and solemn plea of not guilty to the charges here against you, and in truth and in fact are you not guilty? And Hiss answered, I am not guilty. And Stryker said to Murphy, your witness. Well, how would you cross-examine Alger Hiss, a former editor of the Harvard Law Review and probably the smartest guy in the room? He's obviously not going to blubber out a confession in court. One might be tempted to go very light on him and prove everything you need to prove otherwise, but I read somewhere that Congressman Nixon called Murphy and said, you have to keep him on the stand for 3 days. And he said the reason is that Hiss makes a very good first impression, and you can't afford to have that be the impression the jury is left with. Murphy, I think, did about as good a job as anyone could have done, but I don't think he did too much damage. I think he was trying to do a few things, dent Hiss's armor a little here and there, get past the good first impression Hiss makes, get him to repeat his rather incredible explanations about the car and the $400 rug, and the $400 loan and the rug and so on, and hope it sounds incredible to the jury, and also try and get Hiss irritated so he gets into his sort of, don't you know I went to Harvard kind of haughty mode, and that'll turn off the jury. Well, see if you think Murphy achieved any of that. First, Murphy got Hiss to admit that even in his innocent view of his relationship with Chambers, the two men had met 12 or 16 times, counting the Crosleys' several days' stay under the same roof with the Hisses as one time, and including Hiss driving Chambers to New York City. So this is not a casual or slight acquaintance, even according to your version, Mr. Hiss. He also got Hiss to admit that he'd known several far left-wing people, two of whom were widely known or believed to be communists by 1949, and he'd been affiliated with this sort of radical lefty group in the 30s called the International Judicature Association. Now, none of this proves you're a communist or a spy, of course, but it may have dented Hiss's claim that said, I've just been a middle-of-the-road Democrat all my life. And it's a way of saying, no, Alger, you're not as boring as you look. And then Prosecutor Murphy zeroed in on the Robinson-Rubens telegram. Hiss had originally doubted that the handwritten version was in his handwriting, but he now admitted that it was. And Murphy asked Hiss, what possible work-related reason, you were working on foreign trade agreements, what work-related reason would you have for writing out the substance of this telegram in your own handwriting? And Hiss said, easy. When I was working for Assistant Secretary of State Sayre, he was in charge of international trade agreements, lots of documents were sent to him that he didn't have time to read. I read the documents for him, and then I would brief him on the parts of them that I thought he should know about. And sometimes, especially if we were going to lunch, I would write out on little pieces of State Department note paper summaries of the documents or important parts, and I would use them as aids to my memory as I was briefing the Assistant Secretary over lunch. And this is one of those, this is the kind, that's probably why I wrote this. I have no specific recollection of writing this, but this is that kind of a document. Well, Murphy did not thrust home the knife at this time, but the thrust home is that you're working on foreign trade agreements. This thing, the Robinson-Rubens affair, has nothing to do with foreign trade agreements. And even though it was front-page news, and Sayre might want to be briefed about how the incident was unfolding, he likely wouldn't want to be told about the details in this note. So this is not a work-related document. It's not one of your little aide memoirs for lunch. And also, if you wrote these little notes of summaries or extracts, this isn't a summary or an extract. This is the whole body of the damn telegram. If you'd wanted to brief him on the telegram, you would have bought the telegram to lunch. There's no work-related reason for you to write that out. But of course, the Soviet Union would have been intensely interested to know what was in this telegram. So, then Murphy reminded Hiss of his forgetfulness, or dishonesty, if you wish, about many important facts that had emerged. He said, you had heard the name Whittaker Chambers before you testified to Huac, hadn't you, Mr. Hiss? And Hiss said, yes. Murphy said, once in 1947 and once in early 1948, you heard there was a man named Whittaker Chambers who worked for Time magazine who was going around saying that you were a communist. Didn't you know that? And Hiss said, yes. And Murphy said, you made no attempt to find out who this was and why he was saying these vile and incorrect things about you? And Hiss said, that is correct. Murphy said, okay, so when you told Huac 6 months later that you'd never heard the name Whittaker Chambers, that it meant nothing to you, you were forgetting? And he said, yes. But several times in 1946, I heard there were rumors that I was a communist, and I went right to the FBI building, and I asked to see J. Edgar Hoover himself. I eventually saw one of his associates, and I answered every question I was asked. Mr. Hiss, before the grand jury, you remembered every brand of typewriter you'd ever had, except for the Woodstock. Yes. The grand jury asked you if you'd given anything to the Catletts, and you named some gifts, but you didn't mention the Woodstock. Yes, admitted Hiss. And at the same time, you were telling the FBI that you had the big office machine in 1938. Now you say you gave it away in 37. Hiss said yes. And you told the FBI that your wife had given it to a second-hand store, the Salvation Army, or a junk man, and you gave them several other explanations before you came up with the one you're giving now. Hiss said yes. Now, Hiss was, I'm sorry to say, he was just very slippery. In his changing testimony about when did you know it was a Woodstock, when did you remember what you'd done with it, he drew a distinction between what he remembered, which he called his independent recollection, and what other people told him that he believed, which he called his knowledge. For example, he said, "My wife and my lawyer, Ed McLean, have told me we gave the Woodstock to the Catletts. I believe them totally. I therefore have knowledge that we gave the Woodstock to the Catletts, but I don't recall that. I have no independent recollection myself of that." And that is why, in my earlier testimony, when I was asked, "Do you recall what happened to the typewriter?" I said no, although at the time I knew, although I didn't recall, that we'd given it to the Catletts. If only I'd been asked point blank, what happened to the typewriter, instead of, do you remember what happened to the typewriter, I would have given a very different answer. I was only asked about what I recalled, and I answered that question truthfully. Okay, fine. In your testimony to Huac, Mr. Hiss, you remembered the name of every household servant you'd ever had in Washington, except for Clyde Catlett, even though she was the only one who ever worked for you full-time, the one who worked for you the longest, the only one whose whole family, your family, had become involved with, and the one to whose sons you gave the Woodstock. And Hiss said, "Well, I thought she was dead." To which the comeback is, "Well, you weren't asked for the names of your servants who were still alive. You were asked for the names of your servants, and you left out Mrs. Catlett." Murphy also forced Hiss to retell the less credible parts of his story about his dealings with Chambers Crosley. You let this guy drive your car around Washington even though it was your only car. You even gave him the title certificate so that if he'd been stopped by a cop, he could have passed himself off as Alger Hiss. You, a cautious lawyer with two big law firms, subleased an apartment to a stranger who was obviously down on his luck, with no approval from the landlord, no signed lease, no background check references, no security deposit, no first month's rent. You didn't even ask him for the rent until the end of the lease period, and you charged him only what you were paying the landlord, even though the place had your furniture in it. And then after you realized he'd never pay you, that he'd stiffed you, you gave him a car? And he said, yes. He said, this is not totally uncharacteristic behavior for me. I once did another oral short-term lease with another person, and, but yes, Mr. Hiss, but that was a lawyer, that was somebody who worked for the government, who had a job, a regular paycheck, an office where he could be reached if you needed to find him, obviously many times more trustworthy than the disheveled Mr. Crosley. And Hiss said, look, he obviously didn't have any money for a security deposit and all that sort of thing, and I didn't want to scare him off by asking him to sign a lease and character references and all that stuff. I was on the hook for the rent anyway. And even if he only paid me 5 cents, I'd be 5 cents better off than I had been if he hadn't been in there. And Murphy said, well, that's not the whole story financially, though, Mr. Hiss. You were losing money on the deal because you kept the public utilities going in your name, and you paid the public utility bills for the 2 months he was there, didn't you? You were worse off to that extent. And Hiss said, that's true. And Murphy said, you paid for his gas bill. Yes, said Hiss. You paid his electric bill. Yes, said Hiss. You paid their phone bill, said Murphy. And Hiss said, yes, but phone bills in those days were only $3 or $4 a month, a trivial sum of money. And Murphy said, yes, but the Crosleys could have made a lot of long-distance calls in the last month they were there, and they move out with no forwarding address and no office, they're gone, and the next thing you know, you get this big long-distance bill in the mail. You were willing to take that risk? And Hiss said, well, and I'm now quoting, if he had had a long-distance call of any size, I certainly would have taken that up with him. And Murphy said, "You would have ran after him for that?" And Hiss said, "I would have run after him." Alger Hiss, under cross-examination in the trial of his life, still had enough idle brain cells that he could correct the prosecutor's grammar. After 2 days of direct and 2 days of cross, he told his story and suffered little obvious damage on cross, but he's a hard man to like.